Okay, as we already learned in class, we learned how to do direct object pronouns. That is to say, if we want to replace a noun and use a pronoun instead. Today, the object of our video is going to be to discuss how to do double object pronouns. That is to say, how to use both direct and indirect object pronouns. Now, the direct object pronouns can be found in your book. So quickly, before we think about double object pronouns, let's think about how we did direct object pronouns. This is going to correlate with what it is that we'll talk about today. So it's nice to have a quick refresh. You may remember that when we were talking about direct object pronouns, we had me, te, nos, os, and then we also had masculine, feminine, and singular and plural. Lo, los, and la, las. I've written shorthand here just the third person, the lo and the los and the la and the las. This is because when we were thinking about using direct object pronouns, almost all of the time, so 9 times out of 10, when you use direct object pronouns, you will almost always be talking about an object. And if you are talking about an object, you will remember that you will always use third person. So almost entirely, direct object pronouns can be thought about as being in the third person, only associated with replacing objects. So what do I mean? Let's say that I had a friend and I wanted to tell her all about my new cell phone. I was so excited that I had gotten this new cell phone. Now, how would I do that? How would I go about it? I wouldn't say to her when I was speaking with her, my new cell phone is like this. My new cell phone is green. My new cell phone is big. My new cell phone is blue. My new cell phone is Samsung. I would eventually replace it with it in English, right? And we would do the exact same thing in Spanish. The only difference is that in English, when you replace a pronoun with a noun, nothing changes, right? If you say, I bought a new cell phone, and you say, I bought it, you have done the exact same sentence structure. You've done subject, verb, direct object, subject, verb, direct object pronoun. This is not at all the way that this will work in Spanish. In Spanish, when you have to replace the noun with a pronoun, you have to reorganize the sentence. And you may remember this from when we learned how to do direct objects. But here's just a little refresher. So when you replace it in a direct object scenario, you're going to go from having subject, verb, direct object to having subject, direct object pronoun, verb. This sounds a little weird because what you are actually saying is, so you would say, right, I bought a new cell phone, I bought it, but in Spanish you would say, I bought a new cell phone, it bought, right? If you were saying, I sent a letter to Marta, right, you would say, it sent to Marta. You wouldn't say, I sent it to Marta. You would reorganize it to put the it between the subject and the verb. So you can think in a way, right, especially when we think about double object pronouns, we are going to think about the subject and the verb being the sandwich. Those are the 2 slices of bread, and then everything else, the pronouns, are the meat and the cheese that go between. Okay, so let's think about a real actual example. Why would we replace it, right? So here I have my cell phone example. I'm telling my friend about my new cell phone. So I say here, yo compré un celular nuevo. Compré el celular verde. Compré el celular de Samsung. Compré el celular grande y bonito. I get tired. I don't want to say el celular, el celular, el celular over and over. So what am I going to do? I'm going to replace that word, celular, with a pronoun to indicate that I'm still talking about the exact same thing. So, celular here, right, is an object, so we know it is going to be third person, so it would be one of these 4 that we have listed here, okay, and we know that cellular is both masculine and singular, so the one that we are going to use is lo. So now what I need to think about is reorganizing all of my statements, okay? So I would say, yo compré un celular nuevo, okay? So I still have the word celular, so it's still subject, verb, direct object here. So now if I come down here and I want to replace it, right? I would say, here's the subject, direct object pronoun, lo compré en verde. I bought it in green. But what you're saying literally in Spanish is, it bought in green. Here you would say, right? Yo lo compré de Samsung. It bought of a Samsung. Yo lo compré grande y bonito. I bought a big and pretty one, right? So then, but I'm really saying it bought big and pretty. Now that may not make a whole lot of sense in English, but that's how you would literally say it in Spanish. Now the great thing is that the indirect object pronouns are going to function exactly the same. And you may remember these from having gone over them in class. These are, right, me, nos, te, os, and le, and les. This little asterisk you're going to kind of leave to the side for right now, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So these are going to do exactly the same, right? You're going to have a subject, a verb, and an indirect object, right? I sent Marta a letter, right? So when you're thinking about that, right, Marta is going to be the indirect object, and then you would just replace Marta with an indirect object pronoun. I sent her a letter. Now, when we're thinking about indirect objects, it's important to think that usually, in a lot of these scenarios, the indirect object is going to be a person. So when you're thinking about double object pronouns, this can be useful, right? Anytime you see a person, you know that is the indirect object. Anytime you see an object, you know that that is the direct object. So you can choose between the two and know relatively easily which is which, based on whether you were talking about a person and using indirect object pronouns, or whether you were talking about an object and using direct object pronouns. Okay? Notice though with about indirect object pronouns, I listed the first, the second, and the third person because I need all of these to talk about people. I may be talking about myself, I may be talking about us, I may be talking about you, I may be talking about he or she. So I need all of those in order to talk about people. And I would reorganize my sentence exactly the same way. So then if I wanted, but in a lot of these scenarios, right, I'm not just going to mention an object, I'm not just going to mention a person, but I'm probably going to mention both. So what would I do then? What would I do if I had both a direct object and an indirect object? Well, I would be in a scenario where I would have a double object pronoun. The double object pronouns are going to work exactly like you did direct and indirect objects. The only difference is that you are going to have a little bit more of a reordering in your sentence. So normally in your sentence you would have subject, verb, direct object, and indirect object. Here, when you reorganize your sentence to accommodate the pronouns, you would reorganize it subject, indirect object pronoun, direct object pronoun, verb. So you notice the last thing becomes one of the first things that you do, and this second to the last thing is going to become the other one, right? So in a normal sentence, you would probably have your direct object first and then your indirect object. But when you reorganize them in a sentence, the indirect is always going to come first and then the direct object pronoun will come after. So what does that mean? Literally, what does this mean for us as far as how we would actually make this work for us in a real scenario? Well, first of all, we would want to think, right, that all of these are always going to be third person, and these have first, second, and third person. So we want to remember that when we are thinking about direct objects, we're always thinking about a third person, okay? Let's take an example to just kind of look at how these would work themselves out, right? Let's say I said, yo di mi libro a vosotros, right? I gave my book to you. Or I could say, tú enviaste una carta a Ibis. Here, I'm following the exact same structure that I have written up here, right? Because here I have my subject, here I have a verb, here I have a direct object because this is an object, and here I have an indirect object because I am talking about a person. And the second one follows the exact same structure. So I have here a subject, here a verb, and then I have an object here, so this is my direct object, and I have a person here, so this is my indirect object. So let's say that I wanted to replace these with pronouns. I would follow the structure that is listed right here, right? So I'm going to make my little double object pronoun sandwich. I'm going to use my bread, my subject, and my verb to sandwich it between, right? So here I'm going to put my subject right down here, okay? And then the second thing that I would do is I would figure out what are the pronouns that I actually need. So when doing this process, it's really important to think of maybe going through it in kind of a 4-step process. The 4-step process would be, first, find your direct object. Then find your indirect object. Then you want to find the pronouns that you would need in these scenarios, and then it's just a matter of replugging in all your elements, reorganizing your sentence because you have all the pieces that you need. In this scenario, right, if I want to think, okay, well, mi libro is going to be masculine and it's also going to be singular. So I know that it's going to be a lo. So I might write the lo right above the word that I know that I'm going to be replacing. Here, I have an indirect object and it's a vosotros. Well, I know vosotros is a plural and it's also a second person. So I would look over here in my little list and I would see that os is the second person singular. So I might write os on top. So now it's just a matter of reorganizing my subject and verb. I would take my subject, pop it down in the bottom, and then, of course, because my sentence organization tells me that I have to put the indirect object pronoun next, I would write this indirect object pronoun os right here. Then my sentence organization tells me that I have to write the direct object pronoun next, so I would pop that in next with lo. So now that we have found which pronouns need to be plugged into which spaces, we found lo and we found os, now it's just a matter of reorganizing our structure. It's really just that simple. So we're going to follow the exact same sentence structure pattern that we've written up here, right? So I'll take my subject, which is yo, and I'll put it down here. And then I'll take my indirect object pronoun, which I found was os, and I'll put it here. And then I'll take my direct object pronoun, which I found was lo, and put it here. And then all I have to do is take my verb and just tack it right on the end. So I can do the exact same thing for my next example, right? Here I have my subject, my verb, my direct object, and my indirect object. So I've already done my first 2 steps. I want to find my direct object, and then I want to find my indirect object. Then I want to find the pronouns that I would use in each of those scenarios. So what would be the pronoun that I would use for una carta? Well, in una carta is feminine and singular, right? So I would look up here at my chart and I would say, okay, singular and feminine, I'm going to use la. And I might write that above the word that I'm going to need to replace. Then over here, I have a ibis. Well, ibis is a third person and she's also singular. So I know that she is going to be le. The problem that I run into here, though, is that I run into my exception to the rule. You remember this little asterisk over here that I told you not to worry about for right now? Well, now we're going to look at it. You'll notice that right here I have an asterisk over le and les, and I have written se next to it. When I have 2 third persons together in a double object pronoun scenario, I have to replace the indirect object le or les with se. It's only in cases where I have 2 third persons together. And remember, right, that all of these lo, la, la, these are all third person. So really, all that I'm checking when I want to realize whether I need to use the exception or not is if the indirect object pronoun is also a third person. If the indirect object pronoun is also a third person, then I know that I have to change my le to les. So here, or to se. So here, I would have to change this le and use se instead of le because I have 2 third persons together. So now I have all the elements that I need and I can just reorganize my sentence. So I would write my subject here, right, tú, and then I would take my indirect object pronoun and write that next, which I've discovered is se, right, because it's an exception to the rule here. And then I would write my direct object pronoun next, right, so that's la, and I would write that here. And then I would take my verb and I would write it right on the end, right? So I've sandwiched my pronouns between my subject and my verb. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky concept to grasp. So this is just a short introduction into the subject matter. We'll discuss it and practice it more in class. All right, now that we've learned how to use direct, indirect object pronouns and as well as double object pronouns, that is to say direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns together, I would like for you to practice that on a note card. So on one note card, front and back, I would like for you to practice each one of those situations separately. So write direct object pronouns, then write the sentence in and of itself, right? Yo compré los zapatos. And then practice substituting that for the direct object pronoun. For example, yo los compré. And then do the same thing with the indirect object pronoun and double object pronouns. For example, here, right, I labeled indirect object pronouns. Tú llamaste a nosotros, right, without the pronoun, and then I've supplanted the pronoun in it, right? Tú nos llamaste. And then also the same for the double object pronoun. Eliana mandó una carta a nosotros. And then I have substituted both direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns for both my direct object and my indirect object. Here in my second example, Eliana nos la mandó, right? So when you get to class, just pop it on the corkboard and I will check it as soon as I get a moment. And as always, be prepared to share just in case I decide to call on you. Thanks, and I will see you in class.